Well, welcome to another episode of the Warrior's Walk. Today, we're going to tackle something that we haven't discussed yet, and that is how to thrive in a marriage and really discussing the keys to having a marriage that survives the long haul. So stay tuned. So, Keith, you shared with me recently that you had a mistake in your marriage in the early years.
Yes.
Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I know that you haven't made any mistakes in marriage, so I'll just share out my own. But this one was a pretty crucial one that we had to work through. We love supporting nonprofits and giving money, and so there was a point where I had met with a friend of mine who was starting a missions agency, and he was sharing about this amazing program. We went to lunch and discussed it. And I'm thinking, like, the whole time, I'm like, man, this is amazing. Like, I know this guy. Like, I trust the work that he's doing. Like, I know it's gonna be effective. It's something that we could, get behind. And so I committed to sponsor a whole program to help his ministry, without talking to my wife about it at all. So it was a pretty significant for us. It was a pretty significant amount of money to commit to giving away without discussing it all with Caroline. And so I went home, and she goes, "Oh, how'd the lunch go?" And I was like, "Well, I committed to doing this." And she's like, "What?" And it wasn't that she was opposed to it. Like, even if we had discussed it, I think we would have came to the same conclusion. But for me, it was like the first time I realized, I was like, man, like, I just made a pretty significant decision without my wife, involved in that process. And it was just a thing that it's like, okay, like, that was a good thing, but it doesn't mean that that's okay. Like, so we kind of work through that. And so with that, I'm sure there's not been anything that you've done wrong that you'd be willing to share on camera, right? So
Oh, yeah.
what is a thing that might have cost you your long haul perspective of marriage?
Maybe not long haul, but the one that I just shared with you, we hadn't been married a year yet. My wife's still getting her bearings, living on the East Coast. And a teammate of mine, this is back in the era of beepers, he got paged and he was off to go do whatever. And he called me up and he said, "Hey, my sister's landing here shortly. Could you pick her up and let her stay with you till I get back?" And I was like, "Psh, no problem." And so I remember his sister years before, I want to say she was a little junior high girl. Well, when I picked her up, she wasn't a little junior high girl. And I brought her home, and still oblivious as a newlywed that I hadn't done anything wrong at this point, and set her up. We only had a one bedroom thing, so we set her up on the couch. And then when I went in the bedroom, to call it a night, my wife, even though I'm dense, I picked up some vibes that things were not okay. And so I'll spare the listeners all the details, but it was a long night to get things sorted out. And she conveyed that was not cool, and that maybe I could have given her a little heads up. And again, not a bad thing, hosting somebody. She would have gladly done that, but the way it came across certainly showed that I didn't know how to communicate with my bride yet.
Yeah. So communication is key, which we're going to be talking about here in just a moment. So how do we thrive in marriage, and how do we last in marriage? And I think that's an important topic for people that are newlyweds, some people that maybe even have more experience of this marriage thing than we do. And they can probably provide a lot more examples of things that they've done wrong or messed up. But the idea that we're trying to address today is, how do we survive marriage? Not just survive, but thrive. Like, how do we last the long haul and be exemplary for other people in our lives on what a good marriage looks like? And I think we'd agree, this is a very Christian podcast that we're it's no surprise when we talk about how Christ needs to be the foundation of your marriage to really last. And when we focus on our relationships with Christ, we find that our relationships with others, no matter if we're married or not, like, our relationships with others improve when we have a right relationship with Jesus. So what does that mean for you to have that foundation in Christ? How have you guys implemented that in you and Nancy's relationship?
Yeah, I mean, I go to Colossians 3:12 through 14. There's 4 elements I pull out of that when I do weddings. It's the last counseling session. The trick is that it just takes place in front of all the witnesses. But there's 4 things that I think are really important that the Apostle Paul highlights, and that's humility, patience, and then this ideal of forgiveness, and then finally love, right? And so humility, just speed teaching through this, it's that slippery virtue. When you think you've obtained it, you've lost it, right? But ultimately, I think a practical way to live it out is to see your spouse as more significant than you. And one example I've shared over and over is, my wife definitely for a large season of her life likes unsweet iced tea from Chick-fil-A, right? So there's your plug for Chick-fil-A. But sometimes, like when we were dating, I would have drove hours to get her a tea. But when I finish up work and I say, hey, headed home, you need anything, a lot of times it'll be, hey, I'd like you to get me a tea. And then I realize, oh my goodness, I got to wait in line for 20, 30 minutes to get an unsweet iced tea after driving an hour when my bride lives 3 to 5 minutes away from the Chick-fil-A. Oh. And so when I was younger, I would roll my eyes and be frustrated. I wouldn't express that to her, but I didn't do it out of love. I didn't do it out of humility, seeing her as more significant. Mm-hmm. So now it's, if that's what shows love to my bride, then I'm all about it, right? Yeah. And then the patience, what I've found is when I'm messing up in patience is that I've usually forgotten step one is seeing my bride as more significant to me. And I've also learned, background in explosives, when you have a long fuse, it gives you more time to diffuse something so that it doesn't cause lasting damage. Yeah. And so thankfully, my bride and I would describe both of us as not hotheads. We do have long fuses. And so that's definitely important. But then ultimately, and we'll talk about this more in detail, you're going to have to show forgiveness to your spouse. Mm. Paul Tripp wrote a book called What Did You Expect? And the summary is like, you're marrying a sinner and you're going to have to forgive him if you want to make it. Yeah. And every man and woman is going to upset their spouse. Like, you're going to do it. Yeah. And so we need to keep short accounts and we need to forgive each other. And then ultimately love, right? Love like Christ loved the church. We need to love our spouses the same way. And so I would say, again, there's a great book out there, Love and Respect. But in general, men crave to be respected by their brides and women crave to be loved by their husbands. Yeah. Certainly doesn't mean that it doesn't work the other way around as well. But those 4 things are definitely a great place to start.
Yeah. Well, and even, with, as husbands, we are called, in Ephesians, talks about how we are to cherish and nourish our wives. So like cherish, by showing that love to them, but then nourish them with the word of God, like to be the spiritual leader, to walk with them and to encourage them in their faith as well. And so, it's become kind of a cheesy cliche sometimes where, but I think it's still a valid, picture of our relationship in marriage is that, you have like a triangle and, you have the husband on the bottom left corner, wife on the bottom right corner. And then you have God at the top. And as you grow closer in your relationship with the Lord, you're actually getting closer, to each other. And so that's a huge thing I've realized, that like sometimes where it's like, man, we're not, we're just, on that like missing schedule. Like we're like ships passing the night. Like we're not really, growing in that intimacy and thriving in our marriage. It's usually when we're not spending time in the word ourselves, or not really, submitting to the word of God. And so how has that played out in your life when it comes to, like, have you seen a direct correlation with your relationship with the Lord and your relationship with Nancy? Like, how do those go hand in hand for you?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, my goodness, we could spend the rest of our time talking about this, but I think I'm very mindful that, from the SEAL teams, we always talk about front sight focus. For me, I know like the most important relationship in my life, my brides, and anybody else who's a follower of Christ, is our relationship with God, right? And so I've developed a pattern of life where in the morning I'm spending time in the Word, and it's not like checking a box like, oh, drudgery. I crave it. Like I look so forward to getting up, getting that cup of coffee and sitting down and just diving into the Word. And that's my instruction for the day, and I just want to fold those principles in. And the ultimate challenge for all of us is to be more than hearers of the word, but doers. And I still haven't got a fist bump from God at the end of the day. Like I'm still figuring that out. I love Matthew 22 and how Jesus summarized the whole Bible of love God, love others. But that's really hard, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. I mean, we could say it all day long, but that little word all is gigantic, right? Yeah, and so when you bridge that over to a marriage, it is this idea, like I know I'm supposed to love my wife like Christ loved the church, which means I need to be ready to give my life for her, to provide for her, to protect for her. And so there's seasons where maybe I've done that well, and there's definitely times where I've not done it as well. And typically, we all, like my wife and I, are working our way through Romans 8 and trying to memorize it. But that first section in there is just like, it's a contrast between the flesh and the spirit. And the flesh is real for believers, right? We still have an old nature, and we have to crucify it daily. And sometimes I forget to put extra nails in there.
Yeah, that's huge. Now, when I think of people that serve in military, I think about Navy SEALs. I think that they oftentimes are personification of selflessness and sacrifice. And that's not always the case in military relationships, though, like with their families. And so when it comes to even like spending so much time as a SEAL, being in the military, serving our country sacrificially, selflessly, how did that translate to home? Like, was that just an easy way? It's like when you're home, you're living that same kind of selfless mindset, or was it still hard to come back home, you know, after
Mm.
deployment and really serve your wife instead of feeling like you need to be rejuvenated and restored before you go back on the battlefield, you know? So
Yeah.
how did that play out as you were, you know, still in the military?
Well, I'll share first, I think, some of the fails that I had. I think there were some times, especially when you came back from a hard deployment with combat and other things, where I remember one time came home and let's say it was a Saturday. I know it was a quick turnaround, but then the next day we went to church. I needed a little more time to decompress and not to be in a big crowd where everybody's so joyful and skipping around because I still had all those third world images in my head. I was still kind of had that angst and I wasn't ready for the cheesy jokes that I was hearing in church and all the other things that I seen. And it wasn't that anybody was wrong there. It just, I wasn't ready.
Yeah.
I wasn't in a good headspace to participate, to actually go there for the right reason, which is to worship God.
Mhm.
And so, same way in marriage, there's been a couple deployments where I actually parked myself in a hotel for a few days before I interacted with my family. And I just need to get my bearing. And again, that was only a couple times, but it was just like, I need to just decompress, reset. And now I'm ready to actually be a husband and a father and care for my family.
Yeah.
And so I think it's user's choice. I mean, we need to be self-aware of our limitations. And there is that expectation that you can do everything. And there was times I realized I can't.
Yeah. Now, what advice would you give? You know, because I know sometimes like it's hard to cultivate your relationship, you know, with your wife when you're deployed, like when you're physically just not even there. So what advice would you give to, you know, a couple that maybe one of the spouse travels a lot for work, or they, you know, or they have a spouse in the military where they're just gone for long periods of time? How did you guys keep that connection even while apart physically?
Yeah, most of our deployments were letter writing. So we didn't have technology. And, occasionally you might get a payphone, but depending on the threat level where you're at, you didn't make calls. And so for us, it was letter writing. We did learn to number them, because sometimes you would read a letter and it showed up on a ship somewhere and you're reading number 7. You haven't read the first 6. So you're like, hey, your son's cast is coming off today. You're like, I didn't know there was a cast. And so we learned to number them to communicate well. And we did our very best, but I would say we spent a small fortune on payphone bills, just trying to talk and hear each other's voice for a little bit.
Yeah.
That was a big deal. My wife did a great job of putting together care packages and a lot of times little books with just pictures of the kids. And so those meant a lot to me, and just a couple love notes, that I won't go over. But like those were super meaningful. And so I think today, technology, there's pros and cons to it. What I hear is that sometimes it hurts more to be able to see those children, your wife or your husband, depending on the situation. And so there's pros and cons to it. But I know, like, even just thinking about how I stay in touch with my grandkids, I love having FaceTime as an option. And it makes it so much easier to have that relationship. So there's some great tools out there and a lot easier ways to talk. I mean, FaceTime's free. I mean, we spent thousands of dollars on phone bills. And so there's a lot of advantages today that people have that we didn't when I was younger.
Yeah, that's huge. Now, when it comes to, stuff we talked about communication, so even if we're not physically apart from each other, communication is still key to having a lasting, thriving marriage. And so what are some principles that you would give advice for communication in a marriage, in a healthy marriage? What are some guiding principles of how we can communicate better?
So there's a bunch, but I think one of the best things that a husband or wife can do is to truly learn to listen to their spouse and not come up with a rebuttal, just to listen. And, counselors will tell you there's an exercise where you can do speaker listener, and maybe you set aside an evening after dinner. If it's just the two of you, if you have kids, wait till they're in bed. And then you identify who's speaking that night, and the other person just listens with empathy. Maybe there's a problem that they're going through. Maybe it's a problem you're both going through. But that night, your mission is just to listen and then to see things from their perspective. And I'm learning that, over and over with my own bride. Like, because sometimes, self-critique on myself, there's sometimes that I'll hear, you don't hear me. And so I would be wise to slow down and listen instead of thinking about a book she needs to read or a paper I need to give her. It's like, or even chapter and verse. It's like, maybe my wife just needs me to hear her. And so and that works obviously for wives to listen to husbands as well. So I think that's foundational. I think the other is to realize that the person you're married to, they do have flaws, and to be sensitive to that, and just to show grace when possible, and even to coach them a little bit. Because believe it or not, I know this is shocking. I mean, I've been chasing my girl around for 38 years, and I'm still not fluent in woman. I still have epic fails where start off the day in the Word, and I'm pumped. I'm like, all right, good day, and then I mess up before I even head out the door, and I'm like, oh my goodness, how did I blow it already? And so I think that's key too. But there's so many other principles. But man, if we could be good listeners, and then the other, just one more. I mean, again, so many things going through my head, but my wife and I, we try to think about our words and deeds as like deposits in a bank account. And so my goal is to make my wife richer each day. Some days I do major withdrawals, and I certainly hurt her feelings. And believe it or not, sometimes she even hurts mine. But it's this idea, like, that shouldn't be the norm, right? We should be making deposits with our deeds and our words and really building that person up. Because, like, even just last night, I was sitting, in a fire pit with my wife, and she goes, I just need to know you're my person. Yeah. Like, you are my person. And that really encouraged me. I am her person, right? And she's mine. And so, but if you don't do that, you have a tendency to go towards isolation. Like, everything you do, you're either going towards unity or isolation. And I would say a lot of us, by default, we want to withdraw and run away from trouble and home, knowing full well that won't make it better. And I know it's counterintuitive, but like, if you want to confront trouble, you need to go towards it. Yeah. And you can go towards it gently, but you still need to go towards it.
Yep, that's huge. Yeah, I think for Carolyn and I, we've learned, and it was really good because I feel like we learned this early on, and it's really helped us to kind of set the pace, is 3 kind of guiding principles that I would recommend that have helped us a lot. So one, whenever you're talking, to use they call it differentiated self. So like to say, I feel this way instead of you do this all the time. Like, so to avoid overgeneralization, to point fingers, saying like, it's you, it's you, it's you. It's like, and it can be even, directly correlated with something that you did. It's like, when you do this, it makes me feel like X, Y, Z. And even if it's like not jumping to the conclusion of, you make me feel like garbage. It's like, well, when you do this action, it sometimes makes me feel less than worthy of your love. And so even just making even how we're communicating those problems, saying I feel this way instead of you do this, has been just a gradual shift of just how we define things. The other thing is, like, never go to bed angry. So we even look in Ephesians and see that don't let the sun go down on your anger, and unless it's agreed upon. So in other words, like, sometimes it's like, we're so tired, if we continue talking about this, we're gonna say things that, like, are gonna make the things worse. And so it's like, let's take a break, get some rest, on a fresh night's sleep, then we'll talk about it tomorrow and set up a time. And then and that plays into the third thing that we've done that's worked really well. It's called a critical pause. So it's like, if you notice that things are getting heated in a conflict where you're talking, or like, and you can usually tell. So look for the signs. If you can't really tell, you need to be more aware of yourself. So like, if you feel like your heart rate's elevated, or if your voice is getting louder, or if you're getting really tense when you're talking, it's upsetting you, say, hey, look, I'm feeling really upset about this. Let's take a break. And don't just like run out of the room and slam the door. Like, that's not the critical pause that's going to help the situation. So the critical pause is just agreed upon, time where you guys can just take some time away from the conversation before it gets too elevated. Pray, seek the Lord, come back, and then talk about it with a fresh perspective. And like, I don't think there's ever been a time where we've done that and things weren't like oh man, like I was so wrong. And then like, Colin's like, actually, no, I was wrong. I took time to pray, so oftentimes it just helps us to reset and to really seek the Lord and realize like, oh my gosh, I'm being such a dork, with this and being selfish about,
Right.
and then it helps us to kind of reapproach it with a different mindset after we've prayed and sought the Lord on it. So those things have been really helpful for us.
There's two other things before we move on too, as you're speaking, Keith, that I think have been gold for Nancy and myself, and that's we avoid declarative statements. You always, you never, because that's seldom true.
Yeah. It's
right.
like really, you never sleep, you never do anything else. You always leave the towel on
Always
the
and
floor.
never.
Yeah.
Right. So those are good. The other one that we've implemented the last few years is a 24-hour rule. And it's been super helpful. My wife knows, like, I power down. I need to be in bed by 10. I'm just not a late night person anymore. I've given up the vampire hours from the previous life in the Navy. And so she knows, like, to set the environment for a win, at 10 o'clock at night is not the time to initiate a conversation that's going to last a few hours, because I'm just not going to be fully engaged. But if I'm willing to, or if she does bring something up saying we need to talk about X, I need to then give her a time when we're going to talk in the next 24 hours. Mm-hmm. That allows my wife to feel heard. She's like, I'm good. All right. We'll talk tomorrow before dinner or after dinner. And it allows me to be mentally prepared so that I can be my best self for her in that conversation.
That's good. Yeah. That's huge. Now, inevitably, as you mentioned before with that Paul Tripp book, what did you expect? We are sinners that get married, and that doesn't mean that we're going to be perfect. It doesn't mean that things aren't going to go wrong. And so, how do we approach forgiveness and grace when it comes to keeping that thriving marriage going? How do we approach forgiveness and grace as Christian couples?
Well, one, I think it's good to do fact finding. Sometimes we'll have assumptions that can get us in trouble. And so I remember one time coming home from deployment and went to the ATM to get some money out, and I was going to buy my wife some flowers. Well, there's no money. And I was like, what do you mean there's no money? Like, I couldn't even get like $10 out. And so I was freaking out, but I said, and this is again, before you have any way to communicate with your wife and all those things, I thought maybe I should just come home and see what's up. And, my wife's pregnant, the plumbing went bad. She needed new clothes, this and that. And then you realize there's a person living here where when I was single, I'd come back and I just had more money in the bank because I used per diem while I traveled. Oh. And so I think even just gathering all the facts first, but then if you do identify something, then it's bringing it up, and it's just coming clean and saying, you may be the offender. Maybe you need to come clean and confess something, or it's something that you want to confront your spouse. But it's how do you do that in a gentle way where you're creating avenues for restoration, right? And so sometimes I think if you just come across with a hammer, you're really not leaving your spouse much choice on how you confront them. Like, they're probably going to want to go into fight mode themselves. Yeah. And I've learned, this is also super helpful, probably another topic, but I've learned when someone's angry, because a lot of times we are angry when we're hurt, but that's the key. If you come to me and say, hey, Todd, I'm so angry, I'm probably going to be defensive because I'm like, what, are you mad at me? Then I'm going to be mad at you, but if you came to me and you said, Todd, I'm so hurt, I'm going to respond totally different to you coming to me, realizing now 100% of the time, not most of the time, 100% of the time, if someone's angry, there is a hurt behind that anger every time. Oh. And so then it's investigating further, like, what's going on? Maybe there's a behavior that your spouse is doing. And it's like, why are you going to those websites at night? Like, what's going on? And it goes back to what we talked about earlier, right? If you're not growing closer to the Lord, then you're growing closer to the world. And so it's not like you can be stagnant. You're doing one of the two. And so even that, like, encouraging your spouse to have those great godly habits, and encouraging them to be in a Bible reading plan, encouraging them to pray together. Yeah. I read a stat recently. It was as high as like 98% of couples that pray together stay together. My goodness, that's free.
It's huge. Yeah.
That's free. Like, you don't need to go to counseling or anything else. Well, you may need to go to counseling, but the idea that 98% of couples that pray together stay together. My goodness. So that tells me, and again, I'm not trying to dodge, all the forgiveness stuff, but like those things really help when you do have to forgive. And I guess that's the key when I do premarital counseling, and I know you do it also, is it's not if your spouse hurts your feelings, it's when. You need to have a game plan and action on how to restore each other.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think what's helpful to me is even just communicating, hey, I'm on your team. Like it's us against the world. Like we're in this together and not against each other. And so even just that mentality of like, hey, you don't just assume the worst, or don't just, and it's like, hey, I'm team Caroline, or she's team
Mm-hmm.
Keith. Like she's on my side. And I think that helps. It's helpful to to be on the same, like, side by side, rather than facing each other when it comes to any kind of
Yeah.
conflict. But then
Well,
also remember, how much we've been forgiven. Like I think people that hold on to unforgiveness don't really truly understand God's grace and forgiveness that they've experienced themselves, and it's really hard to hold something against other people. Now, I'm not, dismissing legitimate pain or hurt, or, like, I mean, there's obviously accountability, discipline that needs to happen, different things. But when it comes to, little things, like when we just are hurt by something that wasn't even intentional, I think it's hard to hold on to that if we're really understanding, God's grace and forgiveness in our own lives. And it goes back to the parable of the ungrateful servant, like, that was
mm-hmm.
forgiven a lot of debt, and then he goes out and tries to collect the debt in someone else. It's like, you don't understand grace, you don't understand forgiveness if you're going out to claim that on other people
Yeah.
when God's forgiven you for so much.
Well, think about Ephesians 4, right? 31 and 32. I use it almost daily and certainly weekly. But there's, I've always called those 6 steps in verse 31 as the devil's beachhead landing in a heart. But it starts with bitterness, right? It says, let all bitterness, wrath, and anger and clamor be put away with you, along with, slander and malice. But that bitterness, I've always said it's like picking dandelion flowers in your front yard. If you just pick the flower off, the next day you're going to have dandelions.
Yeah.
So you have to address it at the root. So you owe your spouse to come clean. If you're holding something against them in bitterness, like it's impacting your heart as much as them. And so you need to dig it up and reveal it.
It's huge. Yeah. Well, let's cover some rapid fire questions. What are some misconceptions that people often have about Navy SEALs?
Probably the biggest one, and Hollywood doesn't help us here, is that it's kind of the Rambo thing, right? Like that you're a solo entity and you're going to go out and do all the deeds by yourself. And it couldn't be further from the truth. Probably one of the greatest vehicles I had to teach young SEALs is when we would use an aircraft carrier as a platform to work off of. Because, I mean, roughly, give or take, and this is, you can read Clancy's book on carriers. I'm not giving away anything sensitive, but roughly 6,000 people. It's a small city, right? And 24 hours a day, things are going on. I mean, I remember one time asking, how many eggs do you guys go through in a day? And I think they told me semi-accurately like 2 per person. So 12,000 eggs a day. Like that's just one thing moving up and down those ladder ways from storage to where they cook. And so what I would do is I'd show my guys, I says, see the guy peeling potatoes back there? If he doesn't do his job right and the cook doesn't prepare food right, then see that helo mechanic walking by? He's upset. He didn't like the chow that day. He goes in there. He's disgruntled because of the bad food. He misses a check on the helicopter. We all crash and die. Like that kid peeling potatoes is important. And then I would further pull back and even try to coach some of the pilots because, like SEALs, they drink the Kool-Aid and they think they're, the world revolves around them. And so we all have to grow out of that. But there are young kids on there that are 17, 18 years old that are dialing the catapult pressure for these rock star pilots. And if they don't do it right, they die. Yeah. And I was like, I think you should go thank the kid in the 130-degree boiler room that's wearing ice packs so they can live for dialing the catapult pressure right. And so it's just, it's so healthy. But ultimately, just realizing we're a giant team is super helpful. And the misconception that you're doing this by yourself couldn't be further from the truth.
Now, did you actually enjoy like the Rambo movies though? Like were they?
I wasn't a fan,
even though they're not accurate, of course. But
no, that actually those movies didn't reach me. But I'm more of a Jungle Book, and and now that I'm a papa, I got my own movies that I jam to.
Good stuff. Now, when you were on missions, I'm sure you had to make some decisions under pressure. So was there any strategies that you had for decision making when there was a lot at stake?
Yeah, I mean, I think one, you're constantly thinking about your actions and how they impact the bigger picture, right? So you're not just thinking about yourself. You're thinking about how does this impact my immediate people around me and ultimately the mission. And so thankfully, it goes back to what we talked about earlier. It's the training, right? Because you train and we have this giant what if tree and we're going through all the possibilities. That that helps a lot, because you probably already wrestled with that. When every once in a while you do get thrown a curveball, then you're going by principles you've been taught, not to violate key things. And again, it goes back to those basics: shoot, move, communicate. Like you want to shoot well, move well, and communicate well, and most likely you'll succeed.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. And now with I know we've talked about this before too, and you're even doing a lot of research right now on resilience, mental resilience. And so how did SEALs operate at that type of level with mental resilience? Like what was that like during challenging missions? How did you maintain that mental resilience?
So this is where good leadership comes in. I think knowing the pulse of your guys. So again, you're training for months and months to prepare to deploy. And so that same mental resilience is stressed and tested during your workups and on the deployments. And so again, not to be cliche and keep falling back to training, but because you train hard, this isn't your first rodeo when you actually step into theater. And so mentally you're already tuned up and ready. And then what's kind of cool, and is kind of ties into marriage, there are some days when one spouse is operating 100% and the other one's at 50. And so you need to shore the other person up when they're, maybe they're down physically or, spiritually or whatever. And it's the same, like, if you take a group of SEALs, whatever the number is, there's going to be days where some of them, they're just not locked in like they used to. And so you might need to do a little more for that brother, and help them out. But ultimately, I think, again, it's being stressed and tested over and over beyond what you think you can do. And most of the guys, they kind of crack that going through SEAL training. They realize, wow, like I can stay up a whole week and perform. And then that goes back to drinking the Kool-Aid. Yeah. Pretty much, then it's like you almost have to reverse engineer and say, okay, there are some things that maybe you can't do. So like, what are your limitations? Weather becomes a big one, right? Like, can you really sustain yourself in this environment or extreme heat? But all that mental resilience plays out as you spend time just training and working hard.
Yeah, that's good. And so what advice would you give someone who wants to become a SEAL or go into special forces?
Yeah, one, you really want to check yourself on why, right? Because they're going to ask you the same question: why are you here? So you better understand why you're there, because there'll be days that if you don't have a very good reason, you'll quit. And so you need to burn those bridges and realize, like, I'm all in. But then, my job was to make people quit when I was an instructor. And then when they would quit, because a lot of them quit, it's very high attrition rate in any of the programs out there. Then you build them back up and you remind them, like, hey, you're a fine American. It's not like you're out there doing X, Y, and Z. Like, you came in the military to serve and you still have an opportunity to serve. And a lot of times they may perceive what you're doing in training as like, oh, you don't like me, you're trying to kill me. But ultimately you're trying to save their life. And if they don't feel comfortable dealing with stress in a pool, they certainly are not ready for the ocean at night, by themselves in an extremely stressful situation. Yeah. So you're just trying to keep someone from having to write a letter to their mom.
Yeah, that's good. Now let's share your survival tip of the week. You'd mentioned this a little bit about carrying things that have multiple uses with you. So talk a little bit about that.
Well, space is a premium when we're going out, right? And so I'm a big fan of multiple uses for objects. And so dental floss was one I used to carry because, not only is it a pain to have something stuck in your teeth, but it's also nice that you can sew up gear. So I would carry needles around, but, I would use it for that. I could use it for snares. It was very effective. Well, not very effective, but it would work in a pinch. And so there's a lot of things that, repairing equipment, though, was probably primary. And then my other favorite, I have a lot of favorites, but 550 cord, if you're not familiar with that term, it's basically, military cordage, that has 7 more lines inside it. And so each one of those lines can be used for sewing, repairing things, making snares, traps, stuff like that. Wonderful, wonderful item. And of course, America's favorite's duct tape, right? Like I would have duct tape on my ski poles in the winter environment. One, just to choke up on my ski poles if I was, working on the side of a mountain. And that's a whole nother tip. But ultimately, just being able to pull the tape off and to be able to use that. Some people like carrying candles because you could light it for light, in a snow cave or something like that. Or it would just even further your ability to, start a fire in really wet weather. You could light that with a lighter, but then you could start working around that candle. So just look at the things you're carrying. Ziploc bags. I mean, you could use those for multiple uses. But ultimately, if something just has one purpose, you really want to look hard and go, is it worth it? Or if you got something that can do 2, 3, 4 things, man, that's a home run.
It's huge. Yeah. Well, that concludes our episode this week for the Warriors Walk podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you're getting value from this, please share with other people, like, comment, subscribe, do all the things so that helps us to get seen by more people. So thank you so much for tuning in.